The Pacific sky had a way of turning silent at the wrong moments. It wasn't real silence. Engines still roared, wind still screamed past cockpit glass, but inside a pilot's mind there were seconds when everything suddenly sharpened. No distractions, no noise, only instinct, only survival. Lieutenant Aaron Fletcher felt that silence now. He was flying his P-38 Lightning alone, too low, too exposed, and too deep in enemy territory. His patrol should have been routine coast sweeps, distant reconnaissance, nothing unusual. But routine didn't last long in the Pacific. It never did. A shadow moved behind him, then another, and the familiar dread spread across his spine. Japanese Zeros. 3 of them. He glanced at his mirrors. Their silhouettes sharpened instantly, sleek white curved wings closing fast from above with that frightening precision the Zero was famous for. Fletcher's altitude was terrible, his speed was mediocre, his energy reserve was gone, all the advantages belonged to the Zeros, and worst of all, they were on his tail. A Zero behind you meant death, everyone knew that. Once a Zero locked onto your 6, it stayed there. It slipped into perfect position and waited. Fletcher had seen what happened to pilots who tried to outturn a Zero. It was suicide. The Japanese fighter didn't just turn, it pivoted like it was made of paper and razor blades. Even the best American pilots couldn't shake a determined Zero once it began the tail chase. But Fletcher had something those before him didn't. Something he discovered by accident only days earlier. Something that defied logic, defied training, and defied everything the manuals said about dogfighting. It was called the blind turn. The name wasn't official, of course. It wasn't in any textbook. No instructor taught it. No tactician recommended it. In fact, every instructor Fletcher ever had told him the same rule. Never turn without visual contact. Never move blindly. Never surrender awareness of your attacker. But the blind turn required all of that. And that was precisely why it worked. Fletcher felt the Zeros closing. The leader was lining up his shot, holding fire until he was at point-blank range, Japanese doctrine at its finest. Silence still ruled Fletcher's mind, that strange clarity that arrived when danger pressed too close. He lowered his head slightly, tightened his grip on the controls, and braced his entire body. Then, without looking back, he turned. A hard, violent, impossible turn. A turn no pilot should ever make while being chased. A turn that threw every tactical principle into the ocean. A turn that made absolutely no sense. Until the moment it worked. The leading Zero shot past his previous flight path at full throttle, its pilot momentarily stunned. The sudden lateral displacement was too sharp, too fast, too unpredictable. Zeros were agile, but even they couldn't match motion they couldn't anticipate. And the key to the blind turn was unpredictability. Fletcher didn't roll, didn't telegraph, didn't bank gently before committing. He snapped the aircraft sideways, forcing it into a motion that looked reckless, but operated on the hidden weaknesses of the Zero's tail chase doctrine. The Zero overshot, its inertia carrying it forward. The second Zero nearly collided with the first, braking left to avoid the crash. The third, confused by the sudden disruption, pulled up sharply and lost energy immediately. For the first time that morning, Fletcher smiled. The blind turn had saved him once again. But the maneuver didn't come from brilliance. It came from desperation. Only a week earlier, Fletcher had found himself in a similar position, alone, chased by Zeros minutes from death. That day he lost control on accident. A bullet nicked his tail control, locking one side for a full second. His lightning twisted sharply without warning, and Fletcher braced for the Zero's finishing shot. But instead of ending him, that chaotic movement caused the Zero to overshoot completely, stunned by the sudden, unnatural shift. Fletcher survived, landed, and immediately began dissecting what happened. What if a turn with no signal, no rhythm, and no warning wasn't a mistake? But the tactic. He practiced secretly, testing the movement again and again, sudden committed turns with zero telegraphing and with the enemy perfectly placed behind him. It was risky, borderline insane, but in the Pacific, innovation wasn't optional. It was the only reason anyone lived long enough to fight another day. Fletcher now understood exactly why it worked. The Zero's entire tail-chase doctrine relied on prediction, small adjustments, subtle corrections, gentle throttle shifts to stay glued behind an enemy. But a blind turn wasn't predictable. It didn't warn, it didn't ease, it didn't give cues, it broke tail geometry instantly. The maneuver weaponized chaos. But while Fletcher escaped the first attack, the fight was far from over. The Zero leader looped around, furious, adjusting to come down on Fletcher again. The two wingmen regained formation, spreading wide to trap him. Fletcher dove low, pushing his P-38 to its limit, feeling the airframe vibrate under stress. The Lightning's engines roared. The ocean's surface rushed below him. He stayed low deliberately. It was part of the tactic. Zeros loved altitude, they needed it. Their entire combat profile depended on room to maneuver. Fletcher deprived them of that room. He flew so close to the water that the incoming Zeros had trouble committing to their angles. One mistake at that altitude meant instant death. The Zeros approached from behind again, disciplined and determined, but Fletcher refused to climb. He kept the altitude razor-thin, forcing the Japanese pilots into a narrow corridor of risk. Only then did he glance back. The Zeros were close again, too close, almost perfect tail positions. He inhaled slowly through his nose. A blind turn. But this time he didn't go left. He went up. A vertical blind turn was something he had never tried in combat. It was more violent, more dangerous, and far more likely to stall the aircraft. But something in his instincts told him it was time. The Zeros were expecting another lateral snap. They would correct for it, prepare for it, anticipate it. So he broke the pattern. He yanked the yoke back with brutal force. The P-38 shot upward like a rocket, slamming Fletcher into his seat. His vision narrowed into a tunnel. His engine howled. The Zeros, committed to a low engagement line, couldn't follow the sudden vertical displacement. The leader tried and stalled. The second banked away, panicking. The third pulled into a half-loop that wasted precious energy. And Fletcher felt it again, that silence in his mind, that clarity that arrived when he was suspended between death and survival. He flipped the Lightning over the top, rolled right, regained visual, and dove back down into the space the Zeros had vacated. Suddenly, he wasn't the hunted. He was the hunter. And the Zero pilots felt it instantly. The leader, regaining control from his stall, spotted Fletcher coming down at an angle no Zero pilot wanted to see. The Zero's legendary turning ability was irrelevant here. Dive physics favored Fletcher's heavy, powerful Lightning. He opened fire, his guns spitting a tight line of lead. The Zero shuddered, caught fire, and spiraled downward. The other two broke formation again, forced into reactive movements they weren't trained for. Japanese doctrine emphasized coordination, stability, predictability, but against Fletcher there was no predictability, only instability, only chaos. He had turned the fight into something the Zeros couldn't understand, something they couldn't track, something they couldn't chase. The blind turn wasn't a tactic anymore. It was domination. But Zeros rarely retreated, even when losing. The remaining two pilots regrouped as Fletcher climbed again. They wanted revenge. They wanted redemption. They wanted to bring down the man who had just humiliated their formation. Fletcher didn't fear them anymore. He feared the unknown. He feared pushing the maneuver too far. He feared the toll the blind turns were taking on his aircraft. And he feared the moment when the Zeros would finally adapt. But that moment wasn't now, because they still didn't understand it. One Zero dove to force Fletcher low again, while the other came down from above, a pincer trap executed with flawless precision. Fletcher exhaled and rolled slightly, placing the tail-chasing Zero perfectly behind him again. The Zero pilot smiled in his cockpit. He thought the trap had worked. Fletcher didn't smile. He didn't feel victory yet. He felt the moment, the perfect moment. He felt the opening for another blind turn. And once again, he turned without looking. This time he snapped right. The Zero overshot so violently that its pilot nearly blacked out from the unexpected roll. It clipped turbulence behind Fletcher's wake, wobbling chaotically, losing control of its gun sight. Fletcher rolled underneath, gaining position instantly. The pincer collapsed. The ambush failed. The hunter became prey. And Fletcher went for the kill. He fired a short, controlled burst. The Zero burst into flame, its wings snapping off in a violent spiral. Fletcher banked away from the debris, just in time to see the last surviving Zero flee toward the nearest cloud bank, unwilling to test this new, terrifying method again. The sky was suddenly quiet. Finally quiet. But Fletcher didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He didn't even smile. He only breathed. Heavy, controlled, tired. The blind turn had worked again. But it came with a cost. Because now he knew something inevitable. This wasn't the last time he would use it. This wasn't the last time Zeros would chase him. This wasn't the last time he would dance with death. But the blind turn was his answer. His weapon. His salvation. And soon other pilots would need it too. The Pacific sky was bright and calm the next morning, but Lieutenant Harris felt the lingering tension of the previous fight. He had discovered something dangerously effective, a maneuver that shouldn't have worked, yet worked perfectly. A move that turned the most dangerous part of air combat, being chased, into the safest position a P-38 or P-47 pilot could be in. The blind turn. A maneuver born from instinct, not theory. From desperation, not doctrine. And word of his discovery spread through the squadron faster than written reports ever could. Pilots wanted to know how he did it. How he vanished from a Zero's gun sight, how he forced an enemy pilot, trained from childhood to think 2 moves ahead, to fly straight into empty sky. But explaining it was harder than performing it. Harris tried to summarize. You turn before you see, not after. You move inside his assumptions of your movement. You make him think you're blind, but you're the one predicting him. The younger pilots stared in confusion. Veterans leaned in with interest. Because everyone in the Pacific knew one thing. Once a Zero had your tail, it was almost impossible to shake. The Zero's turning radius, its slow-speed agility, its instantaneous response, these made it the king of tail chases. Japanese pilots trained endlessly to anticipate every escape move an American fighter might attempt. Break turns, split-S drops, rolling scissor attempts. Every textbook maneuver was something the Zero had already mastered. But no Japanese pilot was trained to counter a maneuver executed without visual input. A pilot using a blind turn didn't wait to see the enemy's nose. Didn't wait to hear the bullets. Didn't wait to feel the aircraft shake. He turned at the exact moment the enemy pilot expected him not to. That morning, dispatch orders arrived. Another patrol sweep. Another day of hunting and maybe being hunted. The pilots climbed into their aircraft, engines roared to life, propellers blurred into disks of shimmering metal. The formation lifted off the runway and climbed into the warm Pacific air. 2 hours into the patrol, radar reported movement, a mixed group of Zeros sweeping in from the east. Escorts for a reconnaissance plane. The Americans turned toward them. The Japanese, already committed to their route, continued straight. The calm before the storm lasted only seconds. The first dive came from the American side. Harris led the attack, firing a burst across the formation and scattering the Zeros. But he knew what would happen next. The Zeros always regrouped quickly, they always counterattacked, they always tried to get behind someone. And this time they succeeded. A Zero locked onto a young pilot named Dawson, firing short bursts that clipped the tail and left trailing fragments drifting through the air. Dawson panicked, trying a hard brake. It wasn't enough. The Zero stayed glued to his tail. Then Harris broke formation and swung behind Dawson's attacker, but he was too far. He couldn't close the distance in time. Dawson was seconds from being shot down. So Harris did the only thing he knew would work. "Dawson, listen to me," he said calmly over the radio. "When I tell you turn left, don't check your six, don't look, just turn." Dawson's breathing was loud in the mic. "But he's right behind me." "Hear me," Harris said, "don't look, just wait." Behind Dawson's aircraft, the Zero pilot lined up his next burst. He anticipated Dawson's next dodge. The American would bank right. Every American did, because the Zero pilot had forced him into that position with classic pursuit geometry. Dawson's right wing dipped slightly, just enough to sell the illusion. The Zero pilot grinned behind his mask. He fired. The bullets passed inches behind Dawson's true path. And then Harris spoke into the radio with absolute calm. "And now," Dawson jerked the stick left. The Zero's nose overshot wildly. His wings rocked. His firing line disappeared. His airspeed surged into the wrong direction. Dawson didn't see it happen. He didn't need to. Harris did. He rolled into the fleeing Zero's exposed flank and fired a single controlled burst. The rounds tore through the cockpit. The aircraft folded into a downward spiral of smoke. Silence filled the radio for several seconds. Dawson finally spoke. "Sir, I didn't even see him." Harris replied, "That's the point." The rest of the squadron now understood. The blind turn didn't rely on vision. It relied on timing, on predicting the enemy pilot's trigger point, not reacting to it. But the battle wasn't over. More Zeros dropped in from higher altitude, turning the sky into a chaotic web of spirals, dives, and desperate maneuvers. American pilots dodged, fired, regrouped. Japanese pilots pressed relentlessly, using their agility to corner stragglers. One Zero latched onto Harris himself. He felt the vibration of passing bullets. He smelled the faint chemical scent of heated metal. He didn't check his rear mirror. He knew exactly where the Zero was without looking. The Zero pilot tightened his turn, pulling his aircraft into a position that would normally guarantee the kill. He fired again, expecting the American to break right. Harris slightly lowered his right wing as bait. The Zero shifted his aim. He committed. He fired. And Harris yanked left with brutal precision. The Zero overshot so violently that its pilot nearly blacked out. Harris rolled inverted, dropped behind him, and fired a controlled burst that instantly shredded the Zero's tail. Another kill. Another blind turn. Another Japanese pilot who had no idea how he had missed. But this time something else happened. Two more Zeros, Japanese veterans, witnessed the maneuver from a distance. They saw the strange timing of Harris's turn. They saw how the American didn't wait for visual confirmation. They saw an opening in their doctrine. And they began discussing it over radio. One said the American turned before the angle, before the sight. Another replied, impossible, he cannot see behind him. But the first responded. He turned into nothing, into air, yet he escaped. For the first time, Japanese pilots confronted something frightening. The Americans were no longer reacting to their moves. They were predicting them. The battle raged on. Harris guided two more pilots through the maneuver, saving both from being tailed. Each time the Japanese pilots overshot, each time the Zero's greatest strength, its tight turn radius, became its greatest weakness. The tighter the Zero tried to stick, the more violently it missed when the blind turn triggered. By now, Japanese pilots were becoming visibly frustrated. They fired too early. They turned too sharply. They overshot too fast. Their discipline began to fracture. One Zero pilot pushed his aircraft so hard trying to counter the blind turn that his wings nearly tore from the frame. In desperation, he climbed vertically, hoping to catch Harris in a stall fight, but Harris refused to climb. He pulled wide, let the Zero lose its energy, and then rolled back into attack position like a predator waiting for the prey to exhaust itself. The Zero stalled. Shuddered. Fell. Harris fired once more, ending the fight. Soon the surviving Japanese pilots realized something terrifying. Their training no longer applied. Their instincts were now liabilities. Their rehearsed patterns were now traps. They abandoned the fight. Not in formation. Not with discipline. They simply fled, scattering in all directions. Some dove for the cloud deck, engines screaming with strain. Some climbed sharply, hoping altitude would save them. Some turned toward home, hoping speed would. But Harris didn't pursue, because he didn't need to. The battle had already been won. Not by firepower. Not by speed, but by timing, by manipulating the Japanese pilots' expectations down to the fraction of a second. When the Americans landed back at base, mechanics rushed toward the aircraft, checking for damage. Pilots climbed down dripping with sweat, oxygen masks hanging at their collars. Dawson walked straight to Harris. "How did you know he'd fire then?" he asked. Harris removed his gloves slowly, breathing deeply. "Because that's when I would have fired," he said. "He wasn't chasing you. He was chasing the version of you he expected." That message spread through the squadron, then through the entire fighter group, then through the Pacific. American pilots began training to predict Japanese timing. Japanese timing didn't change. For years, it had no reason to. The blind turn exploited that. Within a month, the maneuver was responsible for dozens of Zero losses, often without the American pilot ever seeing the enemy behind him. and Japanese commanders, confused and desperate, began writing urgent reports. American fighters turn into invisible space. They know our firing patterns. Our pursuit angles fail inexplicably. They evade without vision. They called it impossible. They called it unnatural. They even called it luck. But it wasn't luck. It was the first true counter to the Zero's perfect tail chase, and it made every Japanese pilot question whether the enemy could somehow see what he could not. The Zero had dominated pursuit combat for years. Now, all at once, the pursuit fell apart. The Japanese pilots were not used to this feeling. For the first years of the war, they had owned the tail chase. The Zero was built for it, light, agile, perfectly balanced, with controls that responded like extensions of the pilot's own hands. When a Zero locked onto an enemy's tail, the kill seemed almost inevitable. American pilots had learned to fear this moment. Many never survived it. But now the Zero pilots were feeling something unfamiliar. They were feeling the chase slipping away from them. The Americans were not flying faster, not exactly. They were not climbing out of range every time. They were not diving into clouds or hiding behind formations. They were doing something stranger, something subtle, something that rewrote the meaning of pursuit. They were disappearing during the turn. Every Japanese ace knew the rhythm of a dogfight the way a musician knows tempo. They knew how an enemy would break, how they would tighten the turn, how their nose would rise or fall. Combat had predictable beats, predictable patterns, predictable shapes. But Lieutenant Carter's blind turn method broke every pattern. When the P-38 or P-47 or P-51 began its turn, everything looked normal. Japanese pilots adjusted effortlessly. They matched angle, they anticipated the curve, they prepared to cut inside and take the shot. Then, somewhere between the start of the turn and the tightening of it, the American plane vanished from their sight picture. A blink, a distortion, a slight shift in perspective, and the target they had been chasing simply fell away. Zero pilots found themselves overshooting before they even realized a mistake had been made. Their momentum carried them past the arc. Their nose swung wide. Their angles collapsed. By the time they corrected, the American fighter was gone, not in clouds or in the sun, but behind them. The hunted had become the hunter. And the Zero pilot who seconds earlier believed he had the perfect shot now found tracers whipping past his canopy. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was controlled, precise, engineered misdirection. The blind turn began spreading across American squadrons like a quiet revolution. Pilots shared the method in low voices at briefing tables, drawing arcs with grease pencils and illustrating how lifting into the half-roll early, a fraction early, changed everything. Some pilots took longer to understand the method, others mastered it instantly. But every pilot who understood it gained something priceless: the ability to break the Zero's greatest strength. In the next engagement, the Japanese tried something new. A squadron leader, an older ace with over a dozen victories, urged his men to adapt. He explained that the Americans were banking earlier, that they were using rudder input in unfamiliar ways, that the Zero pilots needed to anticipate the blind turn and counter it with a shallow extension before tightening again. But battle is not theory. Battle is pressure. Battle erases plans the moment the first tracer flies. When the engagement began, the American formation split seamlessly. The Japanese pilots followed with confidence, believing they now understood the trick. They committed to their angles. They waited for the turn tightening. They prepared their counter. Then the blind turn unfolded again. But this time the Americans didn't execute it identically. Lieutenant Carter had taught them the deeper truth. The blind turn was not a single maneuver, it was a concept, a way of thinking about the enemy's sightlines, a way of weaponizing the gaps in attention, perception, and geometry. Every American pilot applied it slightly differently. One fighter lifted high into the turn for only half a second before rolling low. Another lifted moderately, then cut throttle to tighten the twist. Another used a climbing roll that forced the Zero pilot to chase into a stalling angle. The result was chaos. Every Japanese pilot reacted correctly to one variation and incorrectly to the others. The squadron leader tried to rally his men. He barked commands into the radio. He attempted to demonstrate the counter-turn, but even he was caught off guard when the American fighter he pursued abruptly vanished into a light crosswind, using the blind turn's timing to slip sideways, then backward into firing position. The squadron leader's cockpit lit up in a shower of sparks as bullets tore through his fuselage. His final transmission was a whisper. "Quiet, Uru. He has disappeared." With their leader gone, the rest of the formation struggled to fight the battle they thought they understood. But understanding meant nothing when the enemy controlled the rhythm. American pilots began deliberately entering tail-chase situations just to execute the blind turn and reverse the fight. It became a weapon of choice, one that punished overconfident pursuers and exploited the Zero's razor-thin margin of error. But something deeper began happening as the tactics spread. Japanese pilots started hesitating. Not long pauses, just fractions of a second, but in aerial combat, fractions were everything. A pilot who once charged aggressively now entered the chase with doubt. A pilot who once trusted his instincts now second-guessed his angles. A pilot who once dove confidently now eased off throttle in uncertainty. Hesitation changed the sky. The blind turn was no longer just defeating Zero pilots tactically. It was defeating them psychologically. For the Japanese, tail chasing had always been their comfort zone, their offensive home turf. Now that domain was becoming dangerous. Every time a Zero latched onto an American tail, the question lingered. Would the American disappear again? Would the chase collapse into a trap? Would the hunted turn into the hunter in the blink of an eye? Fear is not loud in a cockpit. It is silent. It is noticed only in small movements, in the timing of throttle, in the angle of a dive, in the decision to commit or not. And fear spread faster than tactics. By mid-1944, American intelligence noticed something remarkable. Japanese pilots, especially newer replacements, were avoiding tail chases altogether. They stayed at distance. They fired early. They disengaged faster. They broke away from angles that once guaranteed a kill. One American pilot described it with quiet surprise. "They don't want our tails anymore, not after what Carter taught us." In one battle over the Philippines, this shift became especially clear. A group of Zeros attempted to swarm a flight of P-38s. They began well with disciplined, coordinated positioning. But when the first Zero broke into a tail chase, the P-38 pilot executed the blind turn with flawless precision. The Zero overshot, panicked, pulled up too sharply, stalled, and plunged downward. His wingmen saw the collapse and instantly lost confidence. The swarm broke. The formation unraveled. And what could have been a dangerous engagement turned into a rout. The blind turn had not just neutralized the Zero's advantage. It had inverted the advantage entirely. Even Japanese veterans began to admit privately that the tactic was devastating. Some called it sorcery, others blamed turbulence. A few believed the American planes had developed some new mechanical trick, a hidden flap, a torque shift, a secret control linkage. But the truth was simpler. The Americans were using the Zero pilot's own instincts against him. The Zero was designed to maintain perfect energy through tight turns, but the blind turn forced the Zero to commit just slightly too soon or slightly too late, and once the Zero entered the wrong side of the maneuver's timing window, it could never recover the angle. The blind turn was not power. It was timing, not force, but geometry, not brute skill, but insight. Japanese squadrons began pleading for solutions. Commanders held emergency meetings. They requested new aircraft with better roll rates. They trained evasive maneuvers. They studied American flight patterns obsessively. They believed that if they could find the precise angle where the blind turn began, they could neutralize it. But Carter had already spread a crucial truth. The blind turn did not begin at one angle. It began in the enemy's mind. American pilots no longer flew predictable arcs. They no longer followed one sequence of moves. The blind turn had become a flexible strategy, a living tactic adjusted on the fly. The Japanese were trying to counter a moment that was never the same twice. Toward the end of the campaign, one Japanese ace wrote in his logbook, "We no longer lose to their planes, we lose to their decisions." Those decisions showed their full power in the final major engagement of the region. A large Japanese formation attempted to intercept a flight of American bombers. Their orders were to clear the escort first. They approached fast, diving from altitude using aggressive positioning. For a moment the balance seemed even. The Japanese had numbers, they had initiative, they had the element of surprise. Then they began tail chasing. And that was the end of their advantage. Every American escort pilot who saw a Zero on his tail immediately prepared for the blind turn. They did not fear the chase, they welcomed it. They guided the Zero into the perfect window. They let the enemy grow confident. And then they vanished into their arc, letting timing and geometry flip the entire fight upside down. In less than 4 minutes, the Japanese formation deteriorated into scattered fragments. Aces tried desperately to regain control, but their younger pilots were already breaking away in fear. The Zeros disengaged, the Americans regrouped, the bombers continued unharmed. And the blind turn carved its name into the history of the Pacific Air War. After the war, captured Japanese documents showed something fascinating. Analysts had attempted to describe the trick. They called it the disappearing turn. They drew diagrams showing where the American fighter should have gone, diagrams that always failed to match reality. They could never solve it because they were looking in the wrong place. They were searching for a mechanical explanation. But the blind turn wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. The maneuver worked not because the plane moved unpredictably, but because the pilot predicted the Zero pilot's instinct and shaped the turn around that instinct. It was the ultimate expression of combat insight, winning not by overpowering the enemy but by understanding him. Lieutenant Carter never became as famous as many aces. He didn't seek glory. He didn't brag. But the pilots who fought with him, the ones who lived because of him, remembered him as the man who broke the deadliest advantage the Zero ever had. They remembered the single lesson he taught every pilot who joined their squadron. If he wants your tail, give it to him. And then take his. And for the rest of the war, the Japanese never recovered from what that simple idea did to the sky.